everyone, and welcome to this NCVO webinar on topics for engaging with politicians. I'm Rosie Warworth, the Training External Relations Officer at NCVO, and hosting this webinar is my colleague Chris Walker, who is the Senior External Relations Officer at NCVO, who leads on our parliamentary work. Chris has experience of both working in Parliament in various roles for some MPs, followed by time working in policy and public affairs for the Federation of Small Businesses. So I will pass over to Chris now to go over the agenda for today's webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. Just a little bit to start us off on the format for today. We'll start off with a 30-minute presentation from me where I'll go through some tips you can use. And then we'll then have, at the end, 15 minutes set aside for Q&A. So any questions that you have as we go along, please do type them in. We've had some come to us already, but yeah, if you just kind of keep typing any questions that you have as we go along. And then at the end, we will send you a short follow-up survey just for feedback. So if you could please fill that in so we know what you like to update, but also if there's anything we can do a bit better. So looking at what we're going to go through today, I'm conscious that some people will already do this stuff already, have engagement with MPs and peers. So not everything I'm going to say today will be new to you, I'm sure, but hopefully it's at least a bit of a refresher, and we might have a few things to think about. I'm also going to look at a few of the tools that I use and we use at NCVO to make sure that your engagement and particularly your targeting is as well informed as it can be. And we'll also look a little bit at some of the kind of stuff around building longer term relationships and making sure they're mutually beneficial, so both for your organisation but also for the politicians themselves. So I guess it's worth, again, I'm sure many people listening to this will know already why we actually do this kind of thing and why we try to get this sort of long-term engagement. Above all, I think it allows us to effectively influence policy. We have, if we have people who kind of know what we think, are very interested in what we want to do, they can make a credible case for us, kind of both behind the scenes, but also in Parliament. It's really important in terms of helping us to build the kind of cross-party coalitions that we need if we're going to be effective and if we're going to get the sort of policy wins that we're looking for. But then also we can use it to help us do things like pick up intelligence. So actually MPs and peers have got a pretty good idea of what's going on. They'll pick up things from ministers that they can potentially pass on to us if they know who we are and what we're interested in. And sometimes it can be a useful sense check as well to have those politicians who we can go to and sort of quickly canvass their opinion on kind of what some of the kind of top political issues of the day. I think that can be really helpful sometimes. So we're going to look at a poll. So we've got a few polls that we're going to go along as we do today. And we're going to start by asking whether you think it's become more difficult to engage with MPs in the last couple of years. We've had a couple of elections, so quite a few new MPs actually, and also we're right in the middle of Brexit. It's kind of interesting to see if that's maybe had an impact and whether it has perhaps got a little bit harder. So I'll just give you a little bit of time to answer that, and we'll take a look. Okay, so that's quite an interesting mix. So there's a kind of decent proportion of, don't know, perhaps people who aren't kind of regularly engaging with politicians, but kind of seems that there is, for those with an opinion, there's a clear majority, I think, saying yes. And I think that's probably how I felt the last few years. It feels like you're really kind of battling for attention sometimes. So it's kind of quite an important thing for us to be thinking about is what is going to work and what's going to be effective. So I'm going to now go through some tips. I've got 9 tips today, so you know when I'm coming towards the end. And I'll start off with this one, so very much kind of starting at the beginning in terms of when you're first talking to politicians. And I think it's really important to start with what you do and not what you want. So I think if you work in public affairs or policy, it's actually really tempting to kind of get straight into those policy questions when you first meet an MP. But for them to understand and trust you, they actually need to be clear about the impact that it is that you have. I think it's worth remembering that kind of when you see politicians talking about charities in Parliament, it's very rarely to talk about their excellent policy team or their persuasive public affairs staff, however true that is. It's always that difference we make for our beneficiaries. So I think it's really important that that when you are talking to a politician, you can give them that kind of summary of what you do to support your beneficiaries. And I think crucially as well, thinking about the impact that we have and how you can demonstrate that. So those kind of things should be what you're thinking about, I think, so that MPs kind of know what it is that you actually do and what's at the heart of your organisation. So I know that a lot of you will be very good actually at talking about what it is that you do, but it's not always easy. So I thought I would share a couple of resources that we have at NCVO that might be able to help you with some of that stuff. So as part of NCVO, we have Charities Evaluation Service. So there's a link, we'll send these slides to you after the webinar, so you'll be able to kind of access that link. And we have lots of info in helping you both identify your impact, but also be able to kind of describe it to others as well. We've also been working on a website called How Charities Work, and it is public facing in the sense that we use it to help explain to the public some of the things that charities do. But there's also some really good advice there on talking about some of the more difficult issues that charities are facing when it comes to public and political perception. So if you are kind of going to talk to an MP who might be kind of a bit hostile on some areas, kind of knowing the most effective way to be talking about, for example, chief executive pay, I think, can be really useful, and also the kind of some of the issues around overheads and how much charities spend on charitable activity. So I think worth thinking about those if you're thinking about how to talk about what you do. So the second point I wanted to make was it's really important to be thinking about MPs' constituency. So this really applies to MPs rather than peers, this particular point. Remembering that most MPs, their primary goal is about being re-elected. So if they want to, so they're going to want to demonstrate to their constituents they're doing a really good job. So if you can identify issues that are going to matter to an MP's constituents, then you'll inevitably have identified an issue that matters to the MP. So just an example here, we've got a map showing various constituencies and the level of public sector employment. So if you, for example, were talking about public sector pay, then that would give you a pretty good starting point as to the kind of constituencies and MPs you'd want to target. So some of those things, just a couple of examples, could be around particularly important employment sectors, but also in some cases the kind of famous industries that places are really well known for. So in a previous role, I covered pubs policy, and so Burton is a place where there's lots of breweries, so the MP there is particularly interested in pubs. So if you can kind of identify some of those things, that can be quite useful. You're also probably looking for areas where there's particularly high rates of a problem. So if your research is demonstrating that one of the challenges that you're trying to highlight is particularly important in a particular constituency, then again, that could be something that you might use to help you identify the right people to go to. And also, I think it's really important if you, so firstly, if you're a charity that is primarily local, thinking about how you can engage with MPs, you've kind of got that advantage that you're locally based, and so you should use that. And any charity which is national but has branches, again, really useful to kind of use those branches to kind of get that constituency point across. And the way that many other organisations appeal to those kind of constituency issues is through engaging with your supporters as well in constituencies as well. So kind of a few things to think about in terms of targeting particular constituencies. But don't fall into the trap of thinking that MPs are only guided by their constituency. Being able to appeal to their personal interests can really help as well. So the Kennel Club, for example, run a Westminster Dog of the Year competition. So it's great. They kind of go down to Westminster. They have this kind of little dog show. They award prizes, and I'm pretty sure that after that, people are much more amenable to kind of talking policy and the actual issues that they want to raise. And I don't know if we've got anyone from guide dogs watching, but I'm sure they'll also happily confirm that dogs can help them to open a few doors as well. But then also it's worth thinking about politicians' individual political views as well. So if you can think about someone like Kate Hoey, for example, I would guess the majority of her voters in Vauxhall are probably not pro-hunting Eurosceptics, but she cares enough about those issues to continue to take those positions and take them forward. Possibly slightly different for an MP who was in a less safe seat, but you will find that I mean, if you look at someone like Anna Seabury, for example, MPs are often willing to look at kind of their own personal views. And I think it's worth remembering that at the very least, most MPs will have personal interests or areas of expertise that they want to pursue. So for NCVO, we often, when we're looking at kind of which MPs and candidates are likely to be more responsive to us, we look at people who've previously worked in charities or have experience in the voluntary sector or volunteering. So we kind of know that those people might be a bit more open to talking to us. When I worked in Parliament, my old boss, he was previously a teacher, so he always wanted to make sure he was doing things in education. And kind of every single MP will kind of have those things that they want to talk about. But how do you find out, I guess, what MPs' interests actually are? Sadly, we can't all sit and watch BBC Parliaments all day, so we need to have some other resources that we can use. So most monitoring companies will provide detailed biographies, but I'm conscious that not every charity can afford monitoring, so worth thinking about some of the other resources that are out there. I'm sure many of you will have used They Work For You to look at parliamentary proceedings. They've also got various other things that you can do with that. So you can, and I'll show you an example of this in a moment. You can search by how many times people have used particular words. You can find the people who've mentioned your issue most in the last couple of years. And you can also subscribe for alerts as well as to whenever an important issue gets raised. And there's another free service called Polymonitor, which does something quite similar, but for tweets. So you can use that for MPs and peers. And again, very similar. You can search for kind of individual words, phrases, and then you can subscribe to alerts as well. So we did that recently for Volunteers Week because we wanted to see who'd been tweeting about Volunteers Week and what was going on, and so that was a really useful tool for us to be able to use. So this is kind of my quick example to show you what I mean about They Work For You. It's actually I've done charities, so it's not that interesting in a way because we've ended up with basically kind of various ministers who have to say charities a lot. But if you kind of go down those lists, you tend to find something a bit more interesting, and it will get you the kind of a bit of an insight into who might be worth targeting. So we've got another polling question for you. So we were wondering kind of what you find most useful when targeting politicians and what kind of gives you the most information. So I'm sure this is not this doesn't have every option that you can use, but a few things that I've highlighted there. So looking at constituency information, kind of what is that something that you find particularly useful? Are you able to particularly find stuff from biographies in terms of kind of like what people have done before, previous jobs, that sort of thing? so often when I look at briefing on debates, I'll go back and see if there have been similar debates on the subject in the past, and I'll take a look at that. So if that's something you use and find particularly useful, that'd be interesting. And also interesting to kind of see if you don't tend to target, perhaps you kind of do send quite broad things when you're trying to engage with politicians. Yeah, hopefully we should be close to getting well. Yes, excellent. Okay, so kind of real mix there, actually. That's interesting. It's good to see that I think that most people who are doing this stuff are kind of trying to target who they reach, which is great. So biographies, I guess, slightly more popular. So that's interesting, but I guess what that probably tells us is that those are all some pretty useful tools that we can be using and ways that we should be thinking about when we're trying to target politicians. So the next point I think to raise is probably a bit more about when you're actually meeting an MP and you're trying to kind of think about what they want to do and how you might persuade them that your solution is right. So really important to think about how you can fit with what their agenda is. So and that can be both their personal political agendas, but also their party's agenda as well. So thinking very carefully about what it is that they want to do, what their priorities are going to be, and how you can help them to achieve those priorities. So particularly you can identify your very campaign-minded MPs who really do want those kind of campaign wins, and you can appeal to that. But equally, once you start seeing parties talk about particular issues, that can kind of help you to think about the way you talk to MPs and peers about that. So I guess for us at the moment, probably the big thing on the agenda is the civil society strategy. So when we, particularly from a government point of view anyway, so when we're talking to Conservative MPs, I think that's a really useful thing for us to be thinking about, and how our work can fit into civil society strategy, and how we can kind of help them to achieve the goals of the civil society strategy. And I think it's always useful as well if you can, so you don't want to be changing your central message, but actually it's worth thinking about the kind of language you use and who it's going to appeal to. So I think a couple of years ago, when I was doing things around skills at a previous role, actually kind of it got to a point where productivity became this really big issue, and so using productivity felt really important when you were talking about skills, when you could actually be very much talking about the impact it has on individuals and how it can kind of help them. So it's worth kind of looking at kind of what language politicians are using and sort of trying to match that if you can. So the next thing is about, I think we're coming to the kind of point where you've got someone who agrees with you and kind of wants to do something, and it's really important to make sure that you actually as always, really use the right tools for the right job. So in the same way that this very nice old poster reminds us that you should never drive nails with a machinist's hammer, you also shouldn't be getting like a really influential backbencher with the ear of government to table an early day motion, because they can do much more useful and important things for you. So it's kind of really worth thinking about how people can best help you, and making sure that, yeah, if you've got someone who's got that kind of real influence, that they're doing stuff behind the scenes, they're talking to ministers, they're doing kind of that bit of it rather than the kind of wider side of it. Equally, opposition can be really useful for kind of getting an issue a bit more out in public and kind of getting up a bit up the agenda, because they're more likely to be able to be critical and kind of really push on an issue. So kind of worth thinking about kind of where that person sits and how you approach them. I think as well, when you've got MPs who want to do things for you, really important that you give them different options, because firstly, we kind of know that different things will suit different people, but also there might only be so far they're willing to go. So if you are working with a government backbencher at the moment, they might not feel comfortable kind of speaking out publicly. So actually, if you've kind of got that background, that backup option of they could write a letter, perhaps ask written questions if they're happy to do that. So having that kind of those several different options for them. So yes, if you want to raise it publicly, great. If you want to have a debate, Westminster Hall debate, something like that, brilliant. But equally, if you want to do those slightly more quiet things, have a word behind the scenes, put down some questions, or just write a letter, sometimes that can still be useful. So knowing that you've got different options for people to potentially use. Another thing that I think is quite important to remember when you're talking to politicians is that MPs and peers really like talking about campaign tactics and how they can make things happen in Parliament. So 2 reasons then why it's actually really useful to ask for that advice. One, because politicians really like giving it, and so they'll probably warm to you a bit if you are engaging with them about kind of how can we get this in through Parliament. What are kind of people thinking about it? What do you think we should do if you were in our position? But also they all have pretty good advice as well, because they know what's going on in Parliament, they know what's effective, so they can give you really good advice on how to approach issues and the kind of tactics you should be using. They'll probably also have a bit of a sense of where ministers are on certain issues and how you should approach them. So I think very important to kind of be asking for that advice. So going to think a bit more now about some of those slightly longer term issues. So thinking about we've got a kind of group of MPs who know us pretty well, trust us, and kind of know what we're interested in. So how you maintain that relationship. So there's a few different ways. And one I think is really important is make sure you're kind of doing this thing around sharing intelligence and also the work you're doing. So if you're picking up particularly useful bits of information from civil servants, reporting that back into parliamentarians can be really useful for them. And actually, if you do start doing that, they might reciprocate as well, because they will have those kind of odd conversations with ministers in the corridor and kind of can report them back to you if they know you're interested in something. So really useful to kind of have that intelligence sharing set up and remember to kind of think about those questions. But also, whenever you publish something, you should be, and in many cases probably are, thinking about which stakeholders need to see that and when. And you need to make sure you do it with MPs and peers as well. So sometimes that might be quite ad hoc depending on the issue, but sometimes organisations will develop kind of lists or formal systems for who should get what and when they should get it. I have to say I'm probably a bit more informal on that kind of side, but the risk to that is obviously that you are then relying on kind of one person's knowledge or one or two people's knowledge of who the parliamentarians are and who's particularly interested in the issue. So I think if you can formalise it, it's a better way of going about it. So that could even include things like sending embargoed press releases, so sending stuff ahead of when it's released. But do think quite carefully about that, because that can affect the way that story is then covered. So, for example, if you're sending something to an opposition spokesperson that is potentially quite critical of the government, and it has an embargo, will that give them kind of time to brief into various press, and that can really affect the way the story's covered. So it might mean that it doesn't then match the tone or the really careful wording that you've spent hours crafting. So do kind of think about, if I send this, what they actually can do with it and how they're going to use it, because there are potential downsides to that as well. And then so we've got another, our final question, poll question is on that kind of very point about whether you've got a system in place for ensuring that you're in regular contact with the politicians you're targeting. So things that I kind of talked about is, so yes, I've kind of split it up as those kind of, yes, do you have like a formal system that you use? Perhaps you've got proper lists of who to send what to. Do you do it, but it's much more informal, probably more like how I do it, and it's kind of very much reliant on individual issues perhaps, and kind of what you understand that people are particularly interested in, but also perhaps you don't kind of yet have a system, and and could be something that might help you. And I think it can be quite difficult because it's one of those things that it's probably never right at the top of your priority list. So perhaps the summer is not a bad time. So yeah, so I think we've kind of got a bit of a mix there. I think that is something that would be really useful for people to be doing if you're not doing it already. Certainly if you kind of are putting out regular pieces of work. And yeah, I guess I'm in the slight kind of majority of those that do it, in that I do it probably a little bit more informally, but really good to see that there are a good proportion of people who've kind of got those systems in place and you have that ready. So the last thing that I kind of tip that I want to leave you with before we move on to some kind of other resources we've got and questions is worth thinking about all the different ways that you can engage parliamentarians in your work. So I think we're now kind of talking about these people who we know really well. They know what we think on stuff. They probably know what we think even without talking to us about things. So a really good position to be in. So you can really, I think, make those relationships kind of even more concrete with a few kind of extra things to do. So you could be, when you're doing some of your stakeholder research, for example, you might want to actually ask what they think about you, what are the things that you do well, what are the things they think actually you could improve on. You might want to involve them in specific bits of work. So particularly if you're kind of putting together a strategy, you might want to comment on that, particularly if it includes how you're going to approach policy influencing or the way you engage with Parliament. I think many politicians would be really happy to kind of contribute to that sort of thing. And then if you do have kind of individual bits of work that would be useful for them to take part in, kind of a working group on a particular issue, committee that you perhaps set up, then I think definitely worth inviting politicians to be part of that sort of thing. So for example, at NCVO, we have an advisory council, which includes kind of politicians, and it's kind of a useful way for us to sort of bounce particular issues off them. So that's kind of what I've got today in terms of a few kind of overarching tips. I also want to kind of leave you with a few other things that you might want to go away and have a look at. So NCVO Good Guide to Campaigning and Influencing always has kind of a lot of really good stuff in there around the whole range of issues, so always worth looking at that. And I picked out a couple of things. Again, we'll be sending the links to all of this around. So one thing I haven't really covered today, I think, because it's kind of a big subject in itself, is stakeholder analysis. So kind of worth applying some of these principles to that sort of formal stakeholder analysis. So worth having a look at that. And another thing I haven't really touched on too much is the kind of email letter question. So I've included a link to a blog which talks about, so we know that MPs are kind of increasingly concerned with the sort of high volume email approach, and thinking about, okay, well, what can we do to kind of counter that, or actually, you know, is that still effective? And then also just a few things from us that are coming up that might help you out with things as well. Rosie, do you want to talk about with a campaigning conference?
Yes, of course. So this is campaigning conference. It's happening on the 10th of September at NCVO's office in London, which is about 10 minutes from King's Cross. So for those of you that don't know, campaigning conference is for anyone who works in public affairs, policy, campaigns, or kind of press media roles in the voluntary sector. It's a great opportunity to learn from speakers inside and out of the sector, and to meet lots of people who are working in similar roles to yourself and share kind of your experiences of working in the sector. We're really excited. We've got Marsha de Cordova MP coming along to speak as a keynote. So she is the Shadow Minister for Disabled People at the moment. So yeah, if you'd like to hear more about the conference, please feel free to get in touch with myself or Chris. And yeah, places are filling up quickly, so make sure you book.
Great. And we've also got a couple of other training courses there coming up, including certificate in campaigning, which is the kind of our 7-module course that really kind of gets into strategy and kind of how to do various bits of campaigning, plus a couple of bits where I go into a bit more detail about how to approach some of these parliamentary issues. So questions, what have we had?
We've had a few. So we have one from Jessica, which is asking do you have any tips on influencing party manifestos, recognising that different parties have different approaches to this sort of policy development?
The most important thing about trying to influence manifestos is kind of really understanding the process. So actually kind of doing your research on who's starting what when. So you'll already see as well that parties are kind of starting to launch policy consultations. So I know we've taken part in a few things already. So it's worth keeping an eye out on sort of party websites, because they will want to promote them going on. And a lot of that stuff will then feed into the manifesto, and as I say, it's already kind of starting. So doing that stuff long term, always kind of keeping on top when there are particular consultations that are going to be of interest to you. And then for manifestos specifically, I think so much of it is about, as I say, understanding the process, but also understanding who's involved and who's going to be writing it. So that was actually, I think, one of the things that made influencing manifestos really challenging last year during the general election, was you had this really kind of quick process. It wasn't kind of open at all who was writing manifestos. So I think generally, if we're on a kind of normal 5-year cycle, it's a bit easier to kind of get in early and to get a kind of better idea. So certainly, hopefully no more snap elections from that point of view.
Okay, great. And then another question from John. How would you recommend engaging with MPs that don't support your campaign?
Yeah, so I think it's the first thing to say is it is important to do that. And I always think more than anything, it's about how you can shift perceptions to some degree. So you probably, if someone is kind of opposed to your campaign, you probably can't get them to completely change their minds, or very rarely you'll get them to completely change your mind. But I think you can think about what kind of issues are particularly important. I think it's worth actually kind of thinking about what their big concerns are as well, and how you can kind of mitigate those. So really kind of thinking about whenever you put forward a policy solution, there tend to be kind of negative trade-offs, and kind of thinking about how you can mitigate some of those, and that will allow you to speak to people in a way that is not just, well, you're wrong, we're right. You're actually kind of approaching them from kind of where they are rather than where you'd like them to be.
Okay, and then following on from that, we've had a couple of questions, one from Jennifer and one from Oliver, about how you kind of go about re-engaging MPs who, for one reason or another, kind of have always championed the cause, but sort of have gone sort of a bit cold over time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose you might want to actually talk to them even, and kind of get a sense of where they are with you. Still, because I think the thing to remember as well is it might not be a reflection on you. MPs are just incredibly busy and have so many demands on their time that even if they haven't been as active in engaging with you, then that doesn't mean that they're not interested anymore. It might just mean that their diaries are kind of not allowing them to do that. So I think I would say kind of keep up that engagement, and it might be worth, if you do kind of get a chance to sit down with a chat with a chat, to actually kind of just kind of find out where they are and kind of what they're prioritizing at the moment, and kind of where you fit into that, I think.
Okay, great. And then we've got a question from David asking about getting kind of issues on select committee agendas.
So most important thing here is actually, so politicians are one way of doing it, but the most important thing, I think, is to have a relationship with clerks and other staff of the committee. So that can be useful to have kind of the general contact and have those kind of catch-ups on general issues. But also, if there is a particular issue that you're interested in, kind of do bring up clerks and say, we're thinking about submitting evidence to this, kind of what are the things you're particularly looking for. So having those conversations with committee staff are important. But you can think about that with MPs as well. So certainly if you have a relationship with, so I think where MPs are particularly useful with individual MPs are particularly useful with select committees is in kind of initiating bits of work. because they will have their meetings where they decide what things the committee's going to focus on, and if you've got someone there kind of like fighting your corner, that can be quite useful. So I think it's kind of, again, it's like knowing when MPs are the right route, or when you should be doing kind of general engagement with committee clerks and staff.
Okay, great. Then we've got a question coming from Neil asking, in your experience, what's the best way to structure a one-on-one meeting with an MP?
Yes, I think I would always kind of start with a bit of a background into what you do.
Yeah.
Then a kind of as brief as possible explanation of what the issue is. And then try and get their response, and then if they're happy to kind of help you do things, that's when you kind of say that, okay, and this is what you can do to help us to achieve it. So I do, that's kind of what I always have in mind, I think, when I go and see, but sometimes you can get really knocked off track, and every MP is really different and they have different styles, so that's probably your kind of ideal, but also prepare for the unexpected, because you'll get asked all sorts of things, and you need to sometimes just think on your feet a bit as well.
Okay, great. And then I've got a kind of more detailed question from Laura. So she says, often it feels like reviews being open is a really good time to reach out to politicians to offer them evidence that might support their investigations. However, it can be hard to find out information about where they are at with the review before you meet up with them. So do you have any kind of tools or sources that you use that can help with that?
So it kind of depends a little bit on who's doing it, doesn't it? And some of them are not that kind of open. So yeah, I guess probably the most useful thing is to like have a if you can find out who's working it from a kind of staff point of view, that's probably your best contact, I think, and being able to kind of contact them and kind of see how it's going and how you can contribute, because yeah, it's not always easy to tell. You can normally find out when these things start and when they end, but everything that happens in the middle is a bit more tricky. So I think you do need to kind of have that direct link to someone who's working on it, I think.
Yeah. And then a question from Maeve. I think this is probably relevant to lots of NCVO members. What would you recommend very small organisations with limited resources focus on? So should we aim to meet more MPs or develop the relationships with kind of a few?
Yeah, I would say I think generally it's better to have a few really good advocates if you're a small organisation and you just don't have the capacity, because I think that kind of really shallow engagements don't really do that much. It might depend a little bit if you suddenly have an issue which you feel kind of captures the imagination and is going to be a big thing for you, and I think if you want to kind of really affect policy regularly, you need to kind of have a bigger pool of people you can talk to.
Yeah.
But I think for most kind of smaller organisations, actually you probably want someone who can kind of more fight your corner in Parliament, I think. So I think it's worth having or perhaps starting with that kind of small number of very good relationships, I think.
Yeah. And then got something coming from Billy, who I think is probably making a point that you'll agree with, Chris, having worked in Parliament, that he thinks that it's useful to mention about also having good relationships with parliamentary staff too, as they're often gatekeepers for kind of many MPs. But the question is really, do you think people spend enough time on these relationships?
So yeah, I completely agree. And yeah, it's so important because like yeah, they're the people who are ultimately going to get things done. Do we spend enough time? Probably not. And I think it's very yeah, it's always one of those things, I think, that particularly the kind of thinking about it and how you're going to go about it. Yeah, too often I find myself thinking, oh, that MP might help us. I kind of spoke to them 6 months ago, but I'll ring their office. But you know, if you've kind of had that more regular contact, you know it's going to be a bit easier. And so yeah, I think definitely one. We probably won't ever achieve it, but definitely something for us to like try and do a bit more of, I think.
Yeah. And then a question just come in from Karen. What are some top tips for party conferences?
Well, yeah. So I should do something on party conferences at some point, I think. yeah, I mean, I think I sort of think the big thing with party conference is really expensive, and it's kind of the engagement you can get from them is quite limited. So most of my tips around party conference are around um, doing the cheapest stuff you can do, if I'm honest. And that's if you if you can if you've got the resources to have a really good, interesting stand, then by all means do it. But I think for most organisations, it's about attending the right meetings. And I think particularly if I was going to make one big recommendation, it would be try and do stuff that you can't do in Westminster. So have those have meetings that are a little bit different. If you've got things happening locally, do visits, things like visits. But there is a real danger that I think you kind of go up there, you have your meeting plan, and because it's conference, everything gets lost a bit. No one's in the office for a bit. So I think generally it's kind of doing the things that you couldn't do in Westminster. But of course, if you're not based in London, then actually party conferences might be a really good opportunity for you to actually have a lot of those meetings in a short space of time. So yeah, it kind of depends a little bit on where you are, but that would be my.
Yeah, and then coming from Joe, you probably don't answer this. What do you think is the likelihood of an imminent general election?
Well, I think it's pretty low, but I probably said that in May 2017. So no, not May, because it had been announced then, hadn't it? Yeah, so I think it's pretty unlikely. I mean, I think the circumstances would be really difficult. We're right in the middle of Brexit negotiations. I don't think there's much desire for a general election. So because we've now got the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, essentially, either the government would have to kind of whip their MPs to vote for a general election, or there'd have to be a vote of no confidence and no government be formed for a couple of weeks. I think that's pretty unlikely, but I guess never say never at the moment.
And then, yeah, a question coming from James. Is there anything specific you need to think about when targeting members of the House of Lords?
Yeah, so peers are a little bit different. So one of the first things I would say is they don't kind of have those, they're not always as easy to contact. So some of them don't really use email. They all have kind of slightly different ways of doing things. Lots of them don't have staff. So it's kind of really important if you've got a good relationship with a peer to kind of find out what the way they like to be contacted. So I've had things in the past where I've had relationships with peers who are, I basically would send stuff to their whip's office and ask them to like print it out for them and put it in their pigeonhole. So it's finding out kind of those things about how people like to be contacted and kind of what works for them.
Okay, great. And another question is coming from Neil. What is the best way to maintain a relationship with an MP in the long term? E.g., should this be a 6 monthly catch-up in person, or is it sufficient to maintain dialogue via email and briefings?
Yeah, I mean, so one of kind of my reflections of the last few years is I get the impression that people don't really like introductory meetings and catch-up meetings. I sort of think you have to kind of have a point for it. So by all means, try and get those kind of catch-ups, but I would have there being a reason for you to have it. So giving them something that they can take with them. But yeah, a lot of I think you can to some extent like maintain contact on email. Yeah. So I'd say I really do think don't have a meeting unless you've actually got something concrete to discuss, though. Would be my advice on that.
Okay, and we've got a question in from Jennifer. How would you recommend influencing the November budget?
So from my time working at FSB, big thing early, so they will already be thinking about it. And if you put in submissions close to the deadline, you're not gonna get stuff in. And so you should also be kind of talking to people now, really. So talking to officials in particular, getting submissions in early, and probably trying to line up a few kind of friendly, supportive MPs who you can talk to and get to kind of publicly back some of those things in the lead up. But certainly the kind of putting forward of ideas, you need to be doing that pretty quickly now.
Okay, great. I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions.
So just say thank you very much for registering. So again, we're going to send you a feedback survey, which we'd really like you to complete. And if we didn't get a chance to answer, if you had a question we didn't get a chance to answer, my contact details are there. Feel free to drop me a line, and happy to talk about any of the kind of stuff that we've talked about today.